Welcome to the Lean Blog Podcast. Visit our website at www.leanblog.org. Now, here's your host, Mark Graban.
Hi, this is Mark Graban, and welcome to episode 332 of the podcast. It is February 14th, 2019. Joining me today is Jason Burt. He's the owner of EHIP Consulting. He's a consultant with an extensive, diverse background with a manufacturing career of leading and coaching organizations to increase levels of efficiency and performance. Using the Toyota Production System, or TPS approach, has allowed him to positively change cultures to achieve sustainable improvements. During his time at Herman Miller, Jason spent 18 months learning TPS directly from Toyota as a Toyota Lean consultant, and he'll talk about that in the episode. Toyota and Herman Miller were in a partnership during his time with the company, which allowed him to receive direct coaching from Toyota Senseis for the entire 16 years. I was really interested in talking with Jason about what it was like learning from Toyota and their TSSC organization. That's a group that's done great work with a UCLA eye clinic and a food bank, to name two that I've featured on the blog. So here we talk about a wide range of topics. It's a really good conversation, I think. Jason talks about a number of things, including common misunderstandings about TPS and Lean from his perspective, Toyota's goals of developing people and their clients, knowing results will follow versus an ROI-driven approach, and then how he sometimes has to adapt to work with clients and their expectations if they're not Toyota. So if you'd like to find a link to Jason's website, links to some of the good work TSSC has done in the nonprofit realm, you can find all of that and more by going to leanblog.org/332. Well, Jason, hi. Thank you for being a guest on the podcast. How are you?
I'm great, Mark. Thanks for having me on the show. I appreciate it.
Yeah, well, I think we'll have a lot to talk about today. And, as I generally do, I'll let you as the guest introduce yourself and your background, and maybe kind of weave into that story, the story about how you got introduced to Lean and the Toyota Production System.
Sure. Yeah. So my name is Jason Burt. I am the owner of EHIP Consulting, or Evolve Holdings. I am a consultant in the Lean Toyota Production System space. And I really got started within that space back when I was at Herman Miller. I worked for Herman Miller for about 16 years, and fortunately was there along the journey all the way from the beginning, back in about 95, through to about 2011, I believe, is when I left the company. And it was a big chunk of their journey, and I was able to work side by side with Toyota and some great Herman Miller people along the way, to develop and learn as much as I could while I was there.
Yeah, and that's, I think, one of the main things to delve into here today. Your experiences learning from Toyota and TSSC. Some of my roots originally, I started in the auto industry. It wasn't TSSC per se, but I had a very influential plant manager who was one of the first GM people to work with Toyota at NUMMI. And so I'm curious to explore here. I think there's perhaps a difference of learning from a Toyota person or a directly Toyota trained person versus some of the other paths and journeys that organizations take. So 95 was basically the start of the Lean journey at Herman Miller. Is that right?
Yeah, I would say, there were kind of two factions, I would say. You had Toyota started to work with one of the Herman Miller facilities, and it was a recent acquisition. I say recent acquisition, but it was an acquisition over a few years past. And Toyota started working with that facility, and then if you went to Herman Miller kind of corporate, they had another group there that was TBM based and TBM trained that was starting to work. And at that point in time, the entire movement or everything that was going on in the organization hadn't been brought together. So we kind of had two different groups taking two different approaches in 95 when Toyota first started working with us.
Yeah, and TBM, has been a pretty well-known consulting group going back to the early 90s.
Definitely.
I don't remember some of the backgrounds of their founders and what their origin story was. But that's interesting. So you had two different groups with different influences, and I'm curious. When we say factions, it sounds like that was a little combative, or was there some conflict?
Well, there was, because you had different leadership groups that kind of felt their approach was the one that Herman Miller should adopt corporately, and so we both kind of, at the time, they were kind of working in their own space or their own world, and it wasn't till a couple of years down the road where Herman Miller saw the results that happened at one of the facilities with TSSC's guidance, where they said, you know what, the Toyota approach here, this is really what we want to do corporate wide. So for a couple of years there, I wouldn't say it was combative, but it was just, we were trying to exist together at the same time, while, knowingly, up or down south in those facilities, they were taking very much the Kaizen, workshop approach, a 3-day event where we were doing more day-to-day problem solving in Kaizen along with TSSC. So it was different approaches, and we just had to, eventually figure out what that right approach was for Herman Miller and bring everyone together.
Yeah, and I'm kind of jogging my own memory. I just pulled up the TBM website, and their one founder says that he learned from Shingijutsu, which is a fairly legendary name of people who had left Toyota. But yeah, I mean they're known, or at least the reputation is a heavy focus on Kaizen events, and I think that's where they made their name. So that's an interesting comparison of kind of the daily problem solving approach. I mean, when I talk to former Toyota people, Americans or people from Australia who've left Toyota in recent years, I mean, they're always, they always kind of comment when they get out into the broader lean world, they're like, yeah, we didn't do a lot of Kaizen events at Toyota, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, since I've left Herman Miller, I've realized how common that is, and we can talk about that later. But just the perspective of lean in the broader market it's really, there's a lot of misunderstandings across the board compared to someone who is very familiar with the Toyota approach.
Yeah, and then that's where, I mean, gosh, I forget who I heard say this, but if you've seen one lean journey, you've seen one lean journey. Or if you were to ask 100 different companies, what does lean mean to you? There's maybe consistency in some of the principles, but that pathway of what's the journey look like? How do we change an organization from where we are today to more of an ideal state? I mean, there's certainly I think room for different opinions and different perspectives there, but when it gets into the realm of misunderstandings or incomplete understandings, that creates some other issues, right?
Yeah, agreed. And I think there are a lot of people that, I agree with what you're saying, where you say, I think there is a room for a lot of different approaches and styles. I think there's some foundational pieces to the puzzle that we can't walk away from. But, I experience a lot of people that are very set in saying, this is the way, this is the only way, which immediately to me is a red flag, because for those of us that are involved in, the Toyota way and a lean perspective, we should always be very humble and looking for that learning opportunity. So, we should never really take that approach. But I do see a lot of that in the industry, which is to me a little bit troublesome.
Yeah, I agree. When I hear always or never statements, I agree. You should always start with 5S, or you should always do this. And I want to talk a little more about the Herman Miller story, but since you brought up the idea of misunderstandings, one that I've talked about in different ways, here in the podcast, is one where I think it's not just it's not just a different style or an opinion, but one thing that really grinds my gears for what it's worth is when I hear people from more of a Lean Six Sigma background say, well, Lean is all about efficiency and Six Sigma is the approach for quality. Like I could make the case I'm probably preaching to the choir with you on the phone. That I think that's factually incorrect, because the foundations of the Toyota production system are, you could use different words, but just in time flow and Jidoka and built-in quality. I mean, quality is a core part of TPS. So to me, that's a misunderstanding. I'm curious if you've run across that, or since you brought up misunderstandings, what's one that you see out there?
Well, I think that's a great one. I think, I struggle with the term Lean Six Sigma in itself, because I do think that they're two separate things. And I think there's in our industry, a need to, from a marketing standpoint, find the next thing instead of trying to learn and develop your thinking about, I think, what we're already, trying to work on. So I think, just combining those terms in general, I think creates some misunderstanding and some misconceptions in the marketplace. The whole, I know me and you have had some conversations about the BELT process, on LinkedIn. And I think, I'm not a Six Sigma person. I don't know enough about it to talk about it one way or the other. But when I start seeing belts and certifications in the Lean or TPS space, that really starts to become bothersome for me, because I know that that's not how you learn, right? You learn by getting in the trenches and doing it, not by taking a class online and getting a certificate sent to you in the email. So I think there's so many misconceptions and so many paths that we could go on that conversation. I think it's more about, people finding what the right path is for them that's truly impacting the customer, whether you call it Lean, whether you call it TPS, whether you call it, whatever you want to call it, your personal operational system, work with the people, do it through the people, solve problems, and, trying to break away from all the noise that's out there in the industry.
Sure. So maybe let's bring that back then to what it was like being coached by TSSC and some of the journey at Herman Miller. I mean, when you that phrase, getting into the trenches, I mean, was that sort of the approach, or what was it like being coached by the TSSC people?
Well, so when I went to TSSC, let me give a little perspective. When I went to TSSC, that was many years ago, and I was very young in my career. I was only, I was 23, I believe, when I went there. And it was pretty shocking for myself. I was very successful at that point in time at Herman Miller in, I'll say solving problems, but in, doing the work that was necessary at Herman Miller to advance the system. And when I got to TSSC, I didn't realize how big the gaps were for myself personally in terms of, and I guess the biggest thing for me is just basic problem solving. When I was at Herman Miller, I was on the floor, I was diving in and getting my hands dirty and changing the process and working with the people and developing our new system where we were going. But I think because I knew this, I knew Herman Miller, I knew the lines we were working on, I knew the product, it really allowed me to skip a lot of steps in the basic problem solving process. And when I went to TSSC, that was the difference between working with them, is they did not allow me. They forced me to make sure that I was taking the right steps all the way through my journey, no matter how big or small the problem was that I was trying to work with. So, I look at my experience at TSSC, and it was like boot camp for me, problem solving and developing my critical thinking on how to solve problems. It really shaped everything for me in my career from that point on, the way that they taught and coached.
So, and maybe you could kind of lay out the difference between having TSSC on site with you at Herman Miller versus you actually got time to go with TSSC to go work at other companies. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, so
with TSSC?
Yep. So I was able to work with TSSC at Herman Miller when I was a work team leader on the paint line and I think at one point in time I was an ops manager when they were still working there. And then at one point in time, I had an opportunity to go to TSSC and actually become a TSSC employee paid for by Herman Miller. So I spent a year and a half there at TSSC working with different nonprofits, working with different Toyota suppliers, and basically just there to learn as much as I could and develop a deeper level of thinking around TPS so that I could bring it back to Herman Miller. So that was the whole purpose of me being there. So was just to learn. Yeah, it was a great
opportunity.
Yeah, it was pretty amazing.
Yeah, and in more recent years, I've shared stuff like this on the blog. I really admire some of the work TSSC has done and the stories that they've shared of helping improve, reduce delays, improve patient flow in an eye clinic. They did work, with a food bank after Hurricane, I think it was Hurricane Maria that hit New York. And, and they share these stories, and it's great that they volunteer and help different organizations. But one thing that always strikes me is, I think, the humility and the approach. It's not the Toyota person of like, well, I know everything, I'm going to fix you. I mean, it sounds like they're really teaching people to fix their own process and to have ownership of it. And that always strikes me. Does that line up with your experiences, or if you have a story of maybe working with a nonprofit, or what story comes to mind?
Yeah, I mean, it was, there's so many of those stories, even from my short year and a half. And I think the TSSC, when I was there, and I can't speak to it now, it's changed a little bit, but the TSSC, when I was there, their whole purpose was just to develop the people that were there and develop their clients. And it wasn't all about the results in terms of financial results, although that was important. But what was really, their focus was, hey, if we develop the people, both myself and the other people like me and the Toyota employees that were there working within TSSC, and if you guys can develop those leaders at these organizations, we'll all win. Right. That was basically the thought process. So, going in and, one example that I was just, one of my first clients when I was at TSSC was a nonprofit company. I'm trying to remember the name of them, but they basically, they had a very small facility in Indiana, and they employed mentally and physically handicapped employees. That was their purpose. And just, typical TSSC, they were so focused on what do we do to help them be able to remain employed and employ as many people as possible. That was the whole reason we were working there, was just to continue to develop those leaders and help those employees learn how to be better employees and help them engage more and be able to provide a better, make some more money for themselves and provide a better life for them. So, that's just one example where, they're very people focused all the way through. And, I probably learned more working in that one client that I did in some of the very automotive, bumper manufacturers, just because of a completely different perspective around, as people, being an important resource and a different approach to problem solving. I wasn't trying to solve a very specific, quality issue. I was trying to, most of my problem solving there was, how do I make the job fun so that they want to do it? It's a completely off the wall problem solving exercise, but it just created some amazing learning opportunities during my time at TSSC.
Yeah. Well, and it's just, you use the phrase developing people. When I had an opportunity to go to Japan recently, and the group was led by some former American Toyota leader, somebody from Australia, and they all had this common theme and mental model that that the primary goal is developing people. They described Toyota as a people development company, and they roughly said there's buckets of companies that you either are a people development company or you're not. And so that mindset might spread as Toyota people leave and go do other work. But I think one of the challenges as a consultant is that you're often working with organizations that maybe are more in that bucket of not being a people development company. They're focused on the bottom line. They want ROI. There's a demand for short-term results, where I often think about, if you go to the book, The Toyota Way, point one of the 14 principles there is to focus on the long term. So I'm curious, maybe we can come back to the Herman Miller story again, but jumping ahead to, working with organizations today, do you find that you're able to operate in that same style, or do you have to adjust your style to the client and the situation?
Unfortunately, I have to adjust my style in some cases. I'm always looking for those clients, those opportunities where the leadership is truly looking to change their culture for the long term. And I have some of those clients, but I also have those clients that what they're looking for is the bottom line results. And along the way, I'm trying to, teach different leaders within the organization and develop them to see the benefit of looking long term. So, I never will stray from what I think or what I believe is the ideal. But yes, there's such a gap out there, I believe. And I think there's so many companies that really don't understand the power of TPS, and what it should really look like, or what they're even asking for when they hire someone with that approach. So many of my clients, I work with a lot of, private equity firms that'll bring me in and we'll do turnarounds of companies. And as much as possible, I will have kind of my own agenda in the back of my mind where I'm trying to develop the leaders and take a longer term approach, but that's not necessarily the larger picture for them as owners.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, going back to some of the starting points at Herman Miller, Herman Miller may have had pressing business problems or needs at the time. What was some of the impetus, as you recall, for going down this lean path, developing a Herman Miller production system? I'm curious how much of it was business need. Was there a philosophy around developing people that was somewhat in place or developed over time?
I think, it started off with, the one facility that I was at that Toyota started working at. It started off as a very clear business need at the time. That facility, looking across all the Herman Miller companies, was probably last in delivery, last in quality, last in terms of cost of their product, corporate wide. It was to the point where, Herman Miller as a corporate entity was looking at either outsourcing our product or just going and buying it elsewhere as part of their overall product offering, because that particular facility was so bad in terms of performance. So it started off as a business need, and that's why at the time the president of that facility reached out, and it's kind of a long story, but eventually got a hold of TSSC, and Mr. Oba came in and eventually decided to take us on as a client. And so it started off that way. But if you look at Herman Miller's long history, they are a very people-focused company. So there's a strong, culture that was already there that was very empowering to the people. And they really looked at, a lot of the employees as owners. They looked at a lot of the employees as, kind of shared leadership. And so I think once Toyota came in and started showing the results, and we started to kind of explain that approach, the fit was pretty natural, I think, for Herman Miller. There were still a lot of struggles, anytime change and approach and strategy, there's always those cultural bumps and bruises along the way. But I believe TPS really fit in nicely with the people focus of Herman Miller, and it grew from there. So, I think Herman Miller is one of the few companies outside of Toyota and a handful of others that I've seen that I believe the culture truly supported TPS in the right way for the most part across the organization, and that transition was not just financially driven or performance driven. It very much had that people asset to it, where that was a big part of why they were doing it, and it was a big part of the success that they've had over the years in that transformation.
Yeah. Well, and I'll compare and contrast a little bit. When I was at General Motors and we got the former NUMMI person as a new plant manager in 1996. I mean, there was a real compelling, clear business need. Our engine plant was really at the bottom of performance in terms of delivery, quality, cost, everything. But it was a really combative, if not toxic, environment because of decades of history between the company and the union. And so, I can only imagine how big of a challenge that was culturally for Larry, the plant manager, to come in after having been at NUMMI, and he had been at some other plants in the meantime. But it's one thing to teach people about different lean concepts and methods around 5S and Kanban systems, but trying to help crack that nut around the culture was really very much an uphill battle there. So but back to Herman Miller. What are your recollections about some of the development of the Herman Miller production system or some of the early steps that were taken? Realizing that's not a playbook or a cookbook for others, but just always curious, what was some of the story or approach within that plant?
I mean, I think we took, so specifically that plant, you go back to some pretty basic fundamental things. So, it was a very large batch production process. I was in the paint line, so we made small filing cabinets, is essentially, like what would be under a desk. And we would paint 200 black ones, and then we'd paint 300 white ones, and then we'd have to paint 300 tops and fronts, and very large batch production. And the transition was very much starting with the assembly area, going from multiple cell batch operations, developing an assembly line, starting to create some basic flow, and eventually we connected it to the paint line where I was working, and we connected that process all the way through. We were very vertically focused, so we had all the way from rolled steel, stamping out the individual components going into the file cabinet, all the way through paint, assembly, and out the door. So we had all the control within our four walls. We were able to take it from probably, if I remember the data right, it was about 80 hours worth of internal manufacturing lead time down to about 4 hours, over a 2-year process, I would say. So, fundamentally, it's the typical journey. We created some flow. We did a lot of problem solving, worked on changeover, took the paint line changeover from about an hour and a half down to, I believe when I left, we were at about 15 minutes for our powder coat changeover from color to color. So, basic fundamental blocking and tackling. But I think, once again, going back to what I think made it successful was Herman Miller invested in developing them people, whether it was people like myself, the general. We had an HMPS team at the time. It wasn't corporate, but locally. And then when we started to spread it corporately, myself and probably about 5 others, we started working with the top leadership of all the different plants and working through them to start driving the change in all the other facilities. So, once again, trying to drive through the top leadership, develop the top leadership, and drive the improvement and spread it across Herman Miller. But that development that we really focus on is what made a lot of the work be sustainable long-term and be successful there at Herman Miller.
Yeah. Well, and I'm curious what you faced, trying to spread through top management of the plants. I mean, I'm thinking, back to my GM experience on the other side of the state, on the other side of Michigan. before the new plant manager came in, the top leader for those 800 people, we had GM had internal, essentially lean consultants. We didn't call it lean, but those people had been hired in from Toyota suppliers, and there's one guy I remember who had been at Nissan in Tennessee, and they were brought in, but the existing plant manager basically wanted nothing to do with them. They didn't have support at the top of the plant, and those people's time and talent, were really going to waste. I'm curious, thinking back to your time at Herman Miller, this idea of trying to spread it. I mean, was that being driven by a Herman Miller production system group, or did you have good support from really senior leadership within Herman Miller corporate to try to help get the local plant managers to really not just tolerate this or go along, but to hopefully be enthusiastic about it, or to lead it?
So both. So we had, when I came back from TSSC, like I said, there was about 6 or 8 of us. I can't remember that was the corporate HMPS team, and we were the ones that were working directly with all the GMs and VPs, right below the executive level, and teaching and coaching and helping to drive it within the organization. But I will be the first to say the reason that was successful is, yes, we had our specific executive, our COO at the time, was the president at the facility where TSSC started. So he was there, saw it, experienced it. He eventually became the COO across all of Herman Miller, and he really helped pave the way and worked with his team and gave us that runway to be successful in spreading it corporate wide across all the other facilities. So I'll go back to that situation and give him the credit all day long for providing us the platform to be successful in spreading TPS across the Herman Miller facilities.
Yeah, I mean, I imagine he got promoted because that plant is this the same plant that you said was really last in performance?
Yes. Yep.
That must have been quite a turnaround then.
It was quite a turnaround, and I don't know the exact progression of his career, but it was very shortly after that he was basically overseeing the majority of the operations, and that's what he basically looked at all the GMs, looked at all of his VPs, and said, that the HMPS team has 51% of the vote, and as much as someone could take advantage of that, we were a very humble group and didn't really throw that around in any way or anything like that, because we wanted to maintain and develop relationships. But when it did come to that point where we really needed something to happen, we had the support we needed. So we try, our default was to teach, to coach, to influence, but when there was a big decision that was necessary, that was needed, and we needed to, push through this in terms of for learning or for results, we had the backing to get things done, which was a very nice luxury that a lot of companies and a lot of lean leaders out there don't have.
Yeah. Well, and I think of, that plant manager, Larry, and, it was quite a turnaround at the plant where I was. It went from being bottom of the barrel to, at least being in the top quartile within a couple of years as far as the different rankings went. But, it's there's unknowable answer to the thought experiment of what had happened if somebody like Larry really progressed through the ranks within General Motors, somebody who had that Toyota experience, who saw the turnaround and knew what needed to change from a leadership style, culture perspective. I don't think people like that have really risen through the ranks at General Motors. You've had people from finance, Mary Barra, the current CEO, was an engineer, but I don't know from her background if she was really had some of those transformational experiences that Larry had at NUMMI. It's been said that GM has done great work at the plants, but GM corporate culture is still not a lean culture as much as you can generalize.
Sure.
Because I think Larry, kept turning plants around and ended up going and retired and taught at University of Michigan. It's good to hear that there was a different pathway for a leader to really help change the Herman Miller culture. So I'm curious. I'm sorry, I keep reminiscing. I started to keep comparing and contrasting because these were parallel, almost the exact same time in the mid '90s in Michigan in different industries.
Yes.
I can't help but do the compare and contrast.
Yeah. Yeah, no problem. And I think, it would be interesting for me, being gone now from Herman Miller almost 8 years now, to see where they're at, because shortly after I left, that COO retired. And from my understanding, some of the replacements were not people, like you just said, that grew up in the HMPS system. They were outsiders, either from, like a GE background, or I'll get it wrong, I'm not exactly sure, but they had backgrounds that were uniquely different than the TPS mindset or approach. So, I don't stay close enough to where Herman Miller is today, but it would be a very interesting study for myself to go back in and truly see where the culture stands today in comparison to where it was and where it was going. And because we all know that these journeys are so fragile and they can be gone very, very quickly with just one leadership change and not having the right progression of leader to step in place.
And we've seen that happening in healthcare, unfortunately.
Sure.
Leadership change, a leader from the outside can really undo a lot very quickly. But in general, thinking, back up until the time when you left Herman Miller, how much would you say the culture changed? I'm sure it wasn't becoming a copy of Toyota. It was becoming a better Herman Miller than it had been before. But what are some of your recollections about, ways that the culture changed?
Well, I think, it was, we would do some reflection, myself and gentleman Matt Long there, who's one of the VPs around HMPS. And I remember having a conversation with him shortly before I left, and we were kind of reminiscing because we had been on the journey pretty much together the entire time. And we kind of summed it up by saying we can look around and see the philosophies in action. So when we started, thinking about, we can see where people are, being treated as the most important resource. We can see where the leaders are going to the Gemba and practicing shop floor focus, or, where problem solving is the first approach versus going and just buying a new machine. So for us, we saw those things happening. We saw those things around us. You're walking through the offices and you see people in there reflecting and filling out A3s and trying to develop their own thinking around, whatever their problem they're trying to solve. When you see it in action like that, that was when we really started going, wow, this culture has really taken on a path of its own where it's not dependent on Matt or myself or the other HMPS leaders to be driving it every step of the way. It is truly an engine that's fueling itself, and we can see those principles being lived, which that was a very kind of important point, I guess, in our time, where we really felt like, okay, the engine's going. We were more concerned about what's going to stop it than what do we need to do to keep it moving forward. So that our focus tended to change a little bit, just trying to think of, how do we make sure that, like the discussion we were just talking about, all right, this GM right here is a big proponent, but when we look at the next level down, we don't have anyone with deep thinking that's ready to step into his shoes when he leaves or she leaves, and you start thinking about those things versus how do we get that GM to do the right thing. We really did, we could literally see a complete transition in the culture, and it was pretty amazing.
Yeah. So after leaving Herman Miller, can you talk a little bit more about the balance of work that you've done or the differences between being an outside consultant versus, I know there's times where you've stepped in as more of an interim executive role. If you can share some of your experiences there.
Yeah, I don't know, it's an interesting, situation. I do a lot of consulting, and I have had the opportunity where, and I step in to run.
Hey, I'm sorry to interrupt.
No problem.
It cut out. So actually, I'm going to ask if you can just start answering that question again, and I'll make an edit. Sorry.
Sure. Yeah, so that's a interesting question. I think since I've left Herman Miller, majority of my work has been in a true consulting role, but there has been several times where someone calls or a client calls and they've had a top leader leave, and I step in kind of an interim role. And I think it really doesn't change my approach much. I think in both scenarios, I'm trying to teach and coach and kind of be that sensei for the people within the organization, trying to think, long term, how do I, prepare them to continue to be better and better problem solvers every day, and to drive the culture to the next level. I think, to be perfectly honest, what it typically does is it makes it easier, because 9 times out of 10 with my clients, the biggest struggle is that top leader, and getting them to, go down that path. So I would say when I do, act as an interim executive, it makes my life easier, but it doesn't necessarily solve the problem for the company of how do I set them up for success down the road. So no matter what, whether that leader's there and I'm consulting and coaching them, or whether we're searching for a leader while I'm in that position, we still have to put someone in that spot that, that's going to believe in those principles and go down that path willingly with the team. So it's short term, it makes it a little bit easier on me. We can drive some results pretty quickly and influence the company quickly, but I don't think it necessarily is a better thing for the client or that company, because we have to start developing that thinking sooner than later. And very rarely do I ever see where we go out there and we find this leader that jumps in and they're 100%, the right person to, that's 100% on board with TPS and ready to jump in and go. That's not always the case. So, so it's interesting, the two different worlds. But it's, I kind of do whatever my client is looking for and try and, help them to be successful either way.
Yeah. Well, and it seems like, again, there's that tension, or maybe it's tension. Where do you find the balance? Driving results, developing people. Developing people, as you were saying earlier, will lead to results. I mean, I guess a lot of that balance point depends on the time horizon of the PE firm. I mean, there's some private equity firms, have nothing to do with lean, where it's all about really fast, quick, slash and burn, or load up on debt, or do things that maybe aren't great for the long term. But when I've heard about different private equity companies using lean as part of their strategy, it seems like there are some that take more of a medium term perspective, some that are willing to hold the company longer, to take a longer term perspective. I mean, do you see there's sort of a bell curve or a spectrum of different companies out there?
Oh, there's definitely there's a broad range, and you're right. There's all, I don't know the distribution, but the companies that I work with are probably that medium to long term private equity firms, where they're not necessarily trying to buy it and flip it in 24, 36 months. They're probably looking to hold on to it for at least 5 years and willing to hold on to it longer if it makes sense for the company, if it makes sense for them as a private equity firm. There, like you said, there are a lot of those PE firms out there that are looking for the slash and burn, and I get those calls actually more often than I want, and have to tell them that that's not something I'm interested in. That's to the point where we talked earlier in the show about how do I balance that, the request of wanting to really look long-term and stay true to TPS, but, some companies are, my clients are really just looking for the results. For me, that's too far out of the realm. The ones that are looking for me to come in and they just want to slash people's jobs and do whatever they can to make a buck. That's too far to one side for me to be able to support that. So I graciously say no to those PE firms, and I'm pretty happy and fortunate with the ones that I do work with that, they're willing to take a little bit more of a longer term approach.
Yeah. Well, that's great. And I want to step back before we wrap up, stepping back to a little bit bigger picture question, curious your thoughts or experiences with, companies using lean as a strategy for keeping manufacturing jobs in the U.S. as what your thoughts are. Why is that important to you personally?
Well, it's very important to me personally. I guess early in my career, when I was at Herman Miller, and then when I first started getting into consulting, my focus was very much about just outsourcing in general. So whatever company I was working with, when I was at Herman Miller, we were trying to keep everything internal versus going up to the suppliers. Once I left Herman Miller, I kind of got a different perspective that even if it goes to a supplier or someone, in that value stream, that chain down the road from a supply-based standpoint, the jobs are still staying here in the U.S. And so I really shifted that mindset to just all the work that I see going overseas. And the reason it's such a topic for me, I talk with a lot of people about it, is I see so many companies that are making that decision out of desperation or out of a reaction versus it truly being some thought out strategic move. So I see these companies, they get backed into a corner because they haven't been doing the right work. They haven't been doing what they need to do to make their company, the overall performance better, and try and, get away from being backed into a corner to have to take it overseas. So they get to this point. So I'm constantly talking with my PE firms, with, every person that I can, encouraging people to start as soon as possible, because, I have clients and that they had no other choice. They were so far down the road. The gap was so large between their capability and what their competitors were offering, by sourcing it overseas, that they had no choice. And I saw I see the impact that it has on their employees. And I constantly am trying to encourage companies to think about it now. You may not feel the international pressure, or maybe you do, and it's just not big enough for you to do anything about it. But companies need to be looking internally and driving change now and trying to improve their processes so that they don't ever get to that point where they feel desperate and that's all they can do is move their work to some lower cost country or overseas.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was just going to say it's kind of a soapbox for me, Mark. Yeah. I apologize, but I really want people to take action.
Yeah. And, I think I appreciate what you're saying. I agree with you. I mean, my roots are in manufacturing, and, it's devastating to see the effect of, my parents grew up in two communities. My mom, Flint, Michigan, my dad, Northeastern Ohio. My dad listens to the podcast. So hi, Dad. But those communities have been really decimated by failures, strategic missteps, if you will, within the auto industry. In the case of Flint, in Northeastern Ohio, it was just the decline of the big, huge steel mills that, my great-grandfather's generation worked in particular. And, we can do better. That's right. I've been fortunate. If you go back in the podcast archives, there are some manufacturing leaders who have made lean a really strategic imperative for keeping jobs or bringing jobs back into the U.S. So I appreciate that perspective. But, it's a shame when there are these strategic missteps, or as you were saying, they haven't been doing the right things along the way. The executives often then get rewarded for the actions that hurt the employees of the offshoring, the outsourcing, the panic type decisions. And that's a different soapbox. I'll avoid climbing up.
Yes, it is very unfortunate, but yes.
But, so it sounds like there's a lot of really positive stuff that you're doing up there. As we wrap up, let's end it more on a positive note. I mean, like what's one of the success stories, or even just, small moments, that makes you smile thinking back to some of the impact that you see Lean having with an organization or individuals?
Well, I always get just, I love seeing people at all levels in the organization start to get engaged. One of my favorite stories is from Herman Miller early on in our journey. We were doing some work and problem solving on the assembly line, and there was a gentleman there who, I don't even know how it came up, but basically someone went up there and asked him something specific about his job. And he looked at them like they were crazy and said, "Oh, you want to know my opinion?" And he pulled out a folder that was probably an inch thick of all ideas of how he could improve his work.
Yeah.
And he had been just waiting and waiting and waiting for someone to actually ask him what could be done better. And it's those types of situations where, you see someone get engaged and you see them, just the level of involvement and excitement of being able to make their job better or help someone else on within the facility. So those are the types of things that really get me excited. And, and I probably have one of those stories for just about every client that I've worked at where, it's someone that, really jumped into it and got involved and got engaged, and they were able to solve some problems that, without this type of approach, without using TPS and Lean, we probably wouldn't have gotten there with that person, and they wouldn't have had that light bulb and that, just level sense of involvement happen. So
that's great. And I've met nurses who have a similar legal pad full of ideas. and that's the opportunity. That's part of the opportunity in healthcare. Have you been able to work with healthcare organizations?
I really haven't spent much time with them. Like I said, when we were talking earlier before the show, right at my end of Herman Miller, I started working within the healthcare organization, and we started doing some work within some outpatient facilities. And I've spent some time in some healthcare facilities looking at their operations just for my own personal learning, but I haven't done a lot of work in them over the years.
Well, I hope you would get the opportunity to at some point, because I know with your background and experience and mindset, you could really help make a big difference. So I hope you'll get that opportunity.
I appreciate that. My wife's a nurse, so I have lots of conversation with her and her and all of her friends and other managers and stuff, and my wife has advised me that it probably doesn't make sense for me to go in there where she works. So
yeah, it'll be difficult, but that'll give you a good perspective just hearing her perspectives. So, yes. So Jason, where can people find you online? How would you suggest they connect with you in terms of the website? Or I know you've got an ebook on your website that's available. What would you suggest to listeners?
Yeah, I would say I'm available on just about all social media, Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram. But I would say probably the one that I spend the most time on is LinkedIn. I'd love for any and all of your audience to reach out to me, follow, connect with me. I spend a lot of time out there engaging with people. And then my website is another great place to, see some articles, some of my other podcasts that I've been a guest on. So we actually have a link set up specifically for your audience, Mark. So if you go to my website, which is EHIP Consulting, EHIP Consulting.com /Lean blog, there'll be a landing page there for your audience where you'll be able to go there and then you can go through and see whatever you want to see on my website. So those are the best places to connect with me.
Okay. Well, that's great. Thank you. Thank you for doing that. And we'll encourage people to go check out your blog and other stuff on that website. And if people want to search for you on LinkedIn, Jason Burt, Jason Burt.
Yes, thank you.
Can probably find you there. So, Jason, I'm really glad that we had the chance to talk today. Another Michigan person. I always appreciate connecting with people back in my original home state. Any other final thought you want to share with the listeners, Jason?
No, I just really appreciate you having me on the show, Mark. I've really enjoyed connecting with you on LinkedIn and having some good conversations out there. So nice to talk with you on your show, and look forward to meeting more of your audience down the road, hopefully. All
right. Well, thanks again. Our guest again has been Jason Burt. Thank you so much for coming on and having a great conversation. I appreciate it.
All right. Thanks, Marty. I appreciate it.
Thanks for listening. This has been the Lean Blog Podcast. For Lean news and commentary updated daily, visit www.leanblog.org. If you have any questions or comments about this podcast, email Mark at leanpodcast@gmail.com.